Hi guys, this is Jackie Cooper from Jcoopertravels, and today I am super honored to have on as a guest an author, an entrepreneur, and a visionary. His name is Paul Hemphill, and I'm going to show his book. He has written a book called Inspiration for Teens, and he's written other bestsellers as well. And he's actually connecting into our podcast and our Zoom for the YouTube side through his telephone because of the distance. And we are going to be talking about a variety of topics, but I wanted to let you know, in case you're watching from the YouTube side, the connection there. And if you're listening from the podcast side, it won't matter, because if you're traveling and listening, you can't see us anyway, which is fine. But I do want to mention, definitely subscribe to this podcast. And in the block above the podcast, as well as above the YouTube, there will be ways that you can contact Paul to learn more about his educational program and what we're going to talk about today. Paul, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you very much, Jackie, for having me.
So I know that you are an author and a speaker. You have a program that's designed to help teenagers increase their self-esteem with the use of stories and lessons that come from our American history. Why did you take on such a project?
Jackie, I was working with teenagers for the last 19 years for the express purpose of helping them be qualified to get into the colleges of their choice. So in other words, I was a marketer, a college admissions marketer for students. And over those 19 years, it didn't matter what students I was working with, some of the most talented students in the country, they all shared something in common, which I found not disturbing, but pretty natural. And it was low self-esteem. You know, kids would constantly ask me, Mr. Hemphill, am I smart enough? Do I look good enough? Do I walk fast enough? I mean, the self-consciousness that kids have these days is astounding. And during this COVID period, it's getting worse because the suicide rate with teenagers is going through the roof, I understand, these days. And so these kids really need a sense of personal worth that they don't typically get from a high school. And parents are totally discouraged about the possibility of doing anything about it. So I always thought there ought to be some sort of a program at a high school or at a middle school that would help these kids learn about human nature. In other words, what are they capable of at their age? What can they achieve at their age? And they don't have that type of program to help with their self-esteem. So I came up with an approach to doing this, which I've had some people say, well, that's pretty novel. I've had some historians say, I've never seen anything like this before. This is pretty cool. And I thought that using stories from American history would be ideal. In other words, let these kids actually see and read about what happened in our past events with individuals and what struggles they went through and how they got through those struggles so that they can relate to them and come home from school during an afternoon and say to their parents, you're not going to believe what I learned in my American history class today. I was watching this video about this guy who wanted to charge up this hill during the Battle of Gettysburg, and then planning on doing that, I learned how to increase my chances of getting into college. What? And so, in other words, let's make history real, but at the same time that we're making history real and connecting to these kids, that they learn something that they can use in their daily living. And and I've got like 200 lessons in my book, and but I got to tell you, the book is being purchased by parents in droves, but not sure that kids are reading anymore. I decided I had to reach these kids somehow, and so I decided to go with video because I learned later on in this process that every student's favorite tool for learning is video. So if you're not on video, you're not reaching them. So I'm in the process of putting the program on video, and most of it is on video at this point.
That sounds great. How exactly does your program work? So if there was like a school or group that wanted to use it, how does that work?
Well, I follow a very simple formula. The formula to reach these kids is you got to use video, you got to tell a story, you got to keep it short, and then you got to tell what lessons that you can learn from those stories. Just to give you an example, I have a teacher in Minneapolis who is experimenting with the program now, and what she likes about it, and what the kids like about it, is that the video is divided into two areas. First of all, the first part of the video is the story. And then when the story is over with, the video goes into the second section, which is what lessons can you learn from the story. Well, she stops the video right at the end of the story. And she looks at her students and she says, now I want you to break up in groups of 4, and in 15 minutes I want you to come back and reveal to me what you believe are the lessons that you learned from what you just watched. And she said, Mr. Hemphill, you'd be amazed at how these kids are engaged with your videos so that they come back with lessons that mean something to them. In other words, I'm not teaching history from a history book of facts and stats and quotes and all that sort of stuff that kids have to memorize for the next quiz. Instead, they're learning history that actually connects to them. And so when the teachers are enthusiastic, of course, it makes me enthusiastic, and I know I'm on the right track.
No, I definitely agree with you. And American history is extremely important. We've talked about how, Hamilton has made it, very popular. And just like you said, visuals interact with adults too and kids, and it brings things to life. That's why people like to go to the movies. So you're right on point in terms of how to teach and use stories. Storytelling is definitely the best way to go. Why is it better that way though for history being why is it important for history to be taught today? Why do you think that something's going on in the school systems, or why are you focusing on that in particular?
Well, I think that the American history is not being taught in a way that it ought to be. In other words, if it is being taught, it's not being taught in a way that relates to kids. Let me give you an example. A student who has to learn history is only going to learn about something that occurred in the past. Let's say the Battle of Gettysburg in this case. Well, they never participated in that battle. They have no idea what it was like to be in that event, so they're totally disconnected from it. In fact, they have no intellectual or even emotional connection to it. So it's all about something that they can't relate to, and by contrast, they can relate to English or languages or math or science because they can use whatever information they get in those classes right away. But what do you do with the Battle of Gettysburg, or what do you do with the crossing of the Delaware? So students don't know what to do with that information, and because they don't know what to do with it, it's meaningless to them. And as a result, we have a history illiteracy in this country it's staggering. We have 88% of all high school seniors lack any proficiency in American history. What that means is, Jackie, is that they don't know what to do with the information that they had to study for the last quiz. So as a result, it's irrelevant. It's meaningless. It's useless. There's nothing they can do with it. And so when you have an illiterate population of students, it begs the question, if you don't know what your country stands for, how are you going to stand up to our enemies, both foreign and domestic? Now, I always like to say you can't defend, but you cannot define. So we need to have a strong history program, but in a way that engages our students so that they will want to learn American history because it's all about them. It's all about self-improvement. It's all about leadership experiences and recognition of what they're capable of. It's about character formation. And they can get that from following these stories. And by the way, video is the way to go. It's not through books anymore. I got to tell you, David Mccullough, who is America's favorite historian, he once said in a interview, I believe at the Smithsonian, that he would wish that teachers would do away with the textbooks and just tell stories, because stories connect emotionally to us. And we remember facts better when we are emotionally connected to them. So teaching history through a textbook of facts and stats and figures and speeches and all that, there's no connection there. None.
I definitely agree. I know you've been talking about the program. Are there any specific examples of how the stories work and the lessons that come from the stories?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to tell you one. One of my favorites, not that I have favorites, but I've got 88 stories in the book. And one that comes to mind when I sometimes address a group of high school sophomores, I'll walk into the class and I'll read this story from the book. And the actual ending of the story, you can watch the jaws drop. It's basically a story about a young woman. This is not a soldier or a famous general who said something famous and all of that. But this is a young woman who was thrust into a situation that was totally unexpected. She's told that she has to take cans of cool water and give them to the wounded and dying soldiers who are lying flat on their backs on the ground. So what she does is she goes from man to man with this cup of water. She doesn't know what to say to relieve their pain and suffering. She's never been in this situation before. But the story goes that some of these men are looking up at her and kind of imagining that, that's my mother, that's my sister, that's my wife right now. And just by her presence and listening to what they had to say, something that gave these guys some hope. And I always like to say that she was leading these men across a bridge, an emotional bridge of hope over which few of us could cross alone. So as a result, some of these men were able to survive. So the lesson we learned from that story, Jackie, is that even a young person, and guess what? She was only at the time of the battle 15 years old. So it tells us that even young people can keep hope alive where there is none, and that young people, teenagers, can save a life by the simple act of listening. It's such a simple story, but a huge fact that our kids can learn in an American history class, of all places, of what they are capable of doing at age 15 or age 12. It's a powerful story.
It's very powerful, and I know that there are other stories just like that that are equally moving. Yeah. How does the school get your program?
They can go to my website, which is GettysburgLessons.com. And there are several pages there, of course, they can click through, and I have 2 examples of my videos that I call classroom videos, and they can watch those and see exactly. In fact, one of the videos is the story of the girl that I just mentioned.
So for those that might not have gotten the website information, it will be on the podcast and as well as the YouTube in the little box that's above. So you can definitely go back and visit and then be able to click through to reach Paul, as well as additional information. If there's one last thing that you might want to let the listeners know or remember from the conversation, what would it be?
Well, I always like to conclude my speeches to the local Rotary clubs when they ask me the same question. And I always like to quote from a famous American, and you'll probably recognize the quote. If you don't, I'll tell you who it is, but I'll hold off the identity of the person right to the end. But in a statement that was made over 150 years ago, the quote goes like this: "The dogmas of the past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Abraham Lincoln. So usually I get a big applause after after that. Can we have the applause sound effects right now, Jackie?
For sure, for sure, for sure.
But no, we have to. We are at a point, I believe, in the history of our country right now, where we have to, in essence, reinstate the learning of history in our classrooms, not in the way that it's been taught in the past, because it doesn't work, but in a way that answers every student's subconscious question when they walk into every history class, a legitimate question. And that question is, what's in it for me if I study this history stuff? And I'll guarantee you that when you walked into your history class in high school, you didn't get the answer to that question. And no textbook ever gave you the answer to that question. My program answers that question.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for being on, Paul.
Thank you, Jackie.
Everyone who is listening, there's a second part of our podcast that Paul and I are going to be talking about in a short time, and that involves travel, which is something close to my heart. So definitely log on to the second part of the podcast dealing with travel, bucket list and places that we've been and things to go and see. Even though we are currently in the COVID situation, travel is opening up and we will be moving around soon. So thank you again, Paul, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jackie.